Now, so on behalf of the committee, I want to thank two of our members, Sean O'Sullivan and Josie O'Donnell, who have worked particularly hard to make this symposium a success. They were also in charge of the launch of the book on Thursday night, and that was very successful. They've gone to great lengths to assemble an array of historian talent here on my left for your enjoyment and for your information. I'm sure you'll find it very informative. And I want to welcome them all. In attaining Michael Regan as the chairperson and moderator, I think they have achieved the creme de la creme.
Don't speak too soon.
A Kerryman, of course, past pupil of Derrymore National School, little two-teacher school out on the north of the Dingle Peninsula. He's achieved great status as a correspondent with the Irish Times, and of course even greater fame on Kerry Radio with Call from the Dáil and Jerry O'Sullivan on Friday mornings. And in that capacity he endeavours to make sense, and we wish him luck at it, of what's happening in our parliaments. But he brings great savvy and Kerry good sense to the thing, and we enjoy that very much. So now it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to Michael O'Regan to set the symposium in motion. So, Walter.
Thanks, Jerome. My thanks to Sean and the committee for inviting me here. Always delighted to come back to the land of Sigerson Clifford. The older I get, the more I dip into his poem, I Am Kerry. A poem of incredible emotion, yet unemotional. But anyway, it's great to be here in Killorglin. This is today's Irish Times. It's a special souvenir edition. It carries the front page of a century ago. There was a time, Sean, if I came down here and I put that up, I'd be run out to Killorglin. I'd be run out to Derrymore National School as well. But it's quite fascinating. The Irish Times then, of course, unionist Protestant newspaper. The headline is "The Darkest Week in the History of Dublin, an orgy of fire and slaughter." But there is one line in it which I think our distinguished panel will be able to relate to and will, in some ways, skip around and indeed delve into it. It says, "The story of the Sinn Féin rebellion in Dublin begins a long way behind Easter Monday, the 24th of April 1916, and I myself actually were just talking about that, the preamble to the Rising. But I'm just going to say, I'll just say a few words in advance of the speakers. And just to put maybe some kind of context on it, very personal view, of course. In the aforementioned Derry National School, 50 years ago, I was chosen to read the proclamation. It's the foothills of the Dingle Peninsula, literally at the foot of the Schlemish Mountains. And it was quite an extraordinary time in Ireland, because here you had, and anyone who went to a rural national school could identify with this, you had a very small number of pupils because immigration had decimated the place. I remember there was a framed copy, there was a framed photograph of the 1916 leaders sent to every school, and there was a copy of the proclamation. Now, many of these schools, certainly most of the rural national schools, have no running water, for instance. 50 years after Pearse had stood outside the GPO and talked about social and economic development, it really hadn't happened. And the other thing about that 50th anniversary, I think it's agreed now that it was very triumphalist, very one-dimensional, and ignored a lot of what was happening in Ireland at that particular time. For instance, I don't think a half century ago you could have a forum like this. You'd have to have the kind of forum where Pearse was exalted into the manhood we should all aspire to, and where there was no questioning of 1916 of any kind. It's very different this time. Now, 1916 is complex, and obviously while we're skirting over a number of years historically at this symposium, central to it is 1916. I hate this word revisionism when it comes to history. You know, you have, for instance, I saw somebody saying the other day, why can't we just accept what happened in 1916 and move on? But you can't do that, because you have to analyse history. And in doing so, you have to put that historical event in context, and you have to see how it might have influenced society afterwards. We simply don't know if we would have achieved our freedom if 1916 hadn't happened. We simply don't know that. But I'm very concerned in recent years about the manner, for instance, in which Daniel O'Connell, from nearby Caherdaniel, seems to be written out of Irish history. I'm very disturbed about it. Wolfe Tone referred to last night in the brilliant concert here, you know, uniting Protestant, Catholic and dissenter. Something that was forgotten in this era of pseudo-nationalism that we were treated to pre-1966 and post-1966. This daft talk about restoring the language, uniting the country, and everything would be fine. Meanwhile, we were exporting our people at the rate of knots. It's interesting to look back in the 1966 commemoration. I was just looking at some figures recently. Between 1951 and 61, 400,000 people left Ireland. They had to go. They were economic migrants. And one of the things that disturbs me about all our quite justifiable analysis of our history and our commemoration and all that is nobody speaks of our dark history of immigration. There's no memorial. There's very, very few public symposium or seminars on the people who left. A man I know, a journalist, who spent some years as a government advisor at the height of the Celtic Tiger, and his own father had been an immigrant in Mayo. And he said to a minister one day, this is the height of the Tiger, when the money was flowing and we thought we'd never see a poor again. He said to a minister, it's about time we had some kind of memorial to our immigrants. You see, to all those who left, who built Britain in the post-war years, and to into the United States and elsewhere. And the minister said, no, let's forget about Paddy going to Holyhead and the crack in Cricklewood and all that, which was quite shocking. So here we are today, looking at this history. Just any time we analyse history, let's not forget, this community would have known about immigration. I remember myself, when I grew up, all my uncles left, my cousins left, in Massachusetts and elsewhere. Some of them very well and all that kind of thing. But can I just briefly, and without labouring the point in immigration, because I think one of the things we failed to do in the 66 analysis, we're doing it this time, is the failure of the new republic in so many respects. If you look at homelessness, if you look at health, we betrayed, in many ways, a lot of people don't like this, we betrayed the vision of Pearse. Just a brief quote from Donald MacCowley, Geelan Jory, the man who worked on the building sites in England, stayed in Northampton. And of course, his book, Geelan Jory, translated into English by the poet Valentine Armanger. Marvellous read. But he says, and he wrote this is when we were at the height of the triumphalism of 1966. He said, the effect of the mass exodus of the 1950s, both on those who daily converged on the immigrant ship in Dunleera or elsewhere, and those who remained in the rapidly thinning countryside at home, was a wounding cynicism, a bitter state of betrayal, and a kind of shame and self-hatred, born of the need to turn for your bread and butter to the old Saxon foe. Now, the old Saxon foe, we've had a curious relationship with the old Saxon foe. There is no doubt, for instance, in the lead up to 1916 and post-1916, we were an oppressed people. We had the folk memory of the famine. The slums in Dublin were the worst in Europe. We were under the tyranny of a foreign power. That's a given. But later on, as we sent our people abroad, we relied on the immigrants' remittances to keep us going. This is where our complex relationship with the ancient enemy comes in. For instance, between 1939 and 69, the Irish working in Britain sent home remittances totaling 3.5 billion euro. The state would have collapsed economically without the money being sent home by the immigrants. And so we come to the lead up to 1916 and to you know, the rising and all that kind of thing, and where did it go, what happened, etc. One of the things that's never been analysed fully, I think, is the personality of Patrick Pearse. Now, I don't want to be a snide 100 years after somebody died. I don't doubt his idealism. I don't doubt the fact that he was a marvellous educationalist with views way beyond the time. I don't doubt that he was, in some respects, a brilliant poet. But in the lead up to these ceremonies some months ago, I reread Ruth Dudley Edwards' biography of Pearse, The Triumph of Failure, which is a marvellously well-researched biography. And I saw her on television the other night, and she argues her case. She doesn't destroy Pearse, by the way. It's a very balanced book. But I saw her on television the other night where she talked about his apparent death wish. Any analysis of 1916, or that period, has to analyse Pearse's personality. For instance, some of his poetry, The Mother was recited last night brilliantly at the concert. There was other aspects of his poetry, one which is published, which is extremely unnerving. So much so that Thomas MacDonagh and Joseph Mary Plunkett challenged him on it when it was published. It was published, I think, 1914. And Pearse, entirely innocent, as Ruth Dudley Edwards says, was unaware. She refers to the fact that Plunkett was very concerned about the ignoble, as she puts it, interpretation that might have been put on this poem, written by a schoolmaster. It would not be published today. So from that point of view, the blood sacrifice, the apparent death wish, has to be taken hand in hand when any analysis appears. And one of the problems we have historically in this country, whereas Tone has been analysed, O'Connell and everything, for decades, we never analysed the personality of Pearse, unfortunately in my view. Then we come to the validity or otherwise of the Rising. There's no doubt there were idealists. I think if I was around myself, I might well have been in the GPO. I don't know. None of us know. But what has never been dealt with, and I don't want to be entirely negative here, I just want to put this thing in some kind of context, is the validity or otherwise of the Rising. Was Owen MacNeill right? It's a valid question. One of the things, for instance, we were never taught, certainly at my time in school, we were never told about the civilian casualties. Some of them involving children. And just briefly, Sean Foster was 2 years old. He was the first child to be killed when his pram was caught in the crossfire between British Lancers and rebels in Easter Monday. Patrick Featherstone was 12. He was shot in the thigh and bled to death in the street. Madge Veal was 13, a curious unlocker killed in the blizzard of bullets fired during the Battle of Mount Street. John Kirwan was 15. He went out to buy a toy elephant for his newborn sister and disappeared off the face of the earth, close to his family home. Now, I would praise Joe Duffy, the broadcaster, for writing a book which I read recently on those civilian casualties, particularly the children. We covered that as a society for years. The other thing we did, I'm afraid, in that welter of elevating Pearse and his comrades, above all other Irish historical figures for so long, is we created an image of a false society. We buried the scandal of the Magdalen laundries, the industrial schools, and other scandals that would later surface. So I do think that, and we have a very, as I say, very distinguished panel today, I do think that in analysing the period we're looking at today, with Easter 1916 at its core, that we have to take all the facts and then make our own judgment. I'm looking forward to that. We have a star-studded panel, as I say, Dahi O'Caron, Stephen Thompson, Dr. James Ryan, Sinead Joy, Tom Doyle, and Conor Joy. And it's my great pleasure. Oh, by the way, Sean has told me to say, we all have to be out of here by 1 o'clock. So we all have to stick to time constraints. That particularly includes the chairman. If you sit in the press gallery of Dáil Éireann and listen to politicians going on and on and on, you could do it yourself. Sean says if we're not out by 1, he's locking the door, and we can have a round table conference like the TDs in the government are having in government buildings, trying to a form of government. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Daithí Ó Corráin, our first speaker, 1916 in context. He says he's a very interesting man, comes from here of course. He joined the history department of St. Patrick College in 2008. Before that, he was a research fellow in the Centre of Contemporary Irish History in Trinity, a former Government of Ireland research scholar in the humanities and social sciences. He completed his PhD in Trinity in 2004. His main research interests are 19th and 20th century Irish political, cultural and ecclesiastical history, as well as aspects of military history, legal history and historical history. And he's undertaken extensive research in areas like Irish political violence, the Irish Revolution 1912 to 1923, North-South relations, the Northern Ireland Troubles, church-state relations, Ireland in the 1950s and 60s, and humanism. And after with a CV like that, I feel tired of it. So, and we'll hand it over to Daithí.